But first, some of the news over the last several days in Gaza and the West Bank. The Gaza government media office stated on Tuesday that over the last 200 days, more than 34,000 Palestinians have been killed, including nearly 15,000 children, and more than 77,000 have been injured. 30 children have died from Israel's engineered starvation policy, while approximately 17,000 children have lost either one or both of their parents in Israeli attacks. Nearly 500 medical staff, including physicians, specialists, paramedics, and volunteers, have been killed, and more than 300 medical workers have been arrested by Israeli forces. The Geneva-based Euromed Human Rights Monitor says that more than 130 journalists have been killed. This week, Israeli airstrikes and fire from naval gunships have continued to pound areas from the north to the south of the Gaza Strip. Starting with the south, Israeli airstrikes on Rafah near the Egyptian border have continued unabated, while Israel threatens a full-scale ground invasion. Activist Ahmed Mahdoun filmed this video on Sunday.
So as you see, airstrike inside Rafah city. It's near the tents and displaced camps.
That was activist Ahmed Mahdoun. Yesterday on Tuesday, journalist Ahmed Ibrahim posted a video of civil defense crews and residents digging through the rubble after the Israeli military shelled a home in the Salam neighborhood of Rafah. Civil defense told Al Jazeera that at least 3 people were killed and 4 others were injured, all from the same family. On Saturday night, Israeli airstrikes on Rafah killed 22 people, including 18 children, according to reports. The Associated Press reported that, quote, the first Israeli strike in Rafah killed a man, his wife, and their 3-year-old child, according to the nearby Kuwaiti hospital, which received the bodies. The woman was pregnant and the doctors saved the baby, the hospital said. The second strike killed 17 children and 2 women from an extended family. In central Gaza, rescue workers attempted to recover bodies and survivors after an Israeli airstrike turned a residential building into a massive crater in Deir al-Balah. In the north of the Gaza Strip, Israeli forces bombed a residential tower in the Al-Daraj neighborhood in central Gaza City on Monday. Also in Gaza City, Israeli airstrikes bombed the crowded Tufah neighborhood on Monday. In the northern city of Beit Lahia, the Israeli military issued new evacuation orders to the residents who have remained or returned there. Al-Mizan Center for Human Rights stated that this was indicative of a renewed military action and that, quote, 200 days later, Israel's genocidal military campaigns against Gaza continues unabated amid the international community's failure to hold Israel accountable. The United Nations Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, stated that Israel is still preventing food convoys from reaching the northern Gaza Strip. And according to the Gaza government media office, the impact of fuel and cooking gas shortages is particularly severe in northern Gaza, where families have been forced to rely on expensive and unsafe alternatives such as firewood, charcoal, plastic, and chemicals. The media office added that the emissions of toxic fumes because of the burning of such materials is leading to the spread of respiratory diseases, and the long-standing constraints on the entry of fuel have also affected food production facilities, including restaurants and bakeries, limiting people's access to nutritious meals and exacerbating food insecurity. Following the discovery 2 weeks ago of mass graves in the courtyard of Al-Shifa Hospital, the largest medical facility in Gaza, which was completely destroyed by the Israeli army, more mass graves were uncovered earlier this week on the grounds of Nasser Hospital in the southern city of Khan Yunis. At least 310 bodies have been recovered so far from the mass graves at Nasser Hospital, buried deep in the ground and covered with waste, according to the United Nations. Bodies discovered by family members and civil defense crews included those with zip tie handcuffs still on their arms, others wearing hospital scrubs, women and elders, some bound and stripped of clothing, and bodies with intravenous lines, catheters, and bandages still attached, clearly patients who were executed. Al Jazeera's Hani Mahmoud reported on the situation around Nasser Hospital on Monday.
Withdrew from Khan Yunis on April the 7th after 4 months of intense raids and airstrikes, leaving behind a trail of destruction and mass graves. The teams who recovered the dead say some were shot from behind, execution style. Others were found with their hands tied behind their backs. Many more are believed to be buried on the grounds of the largest medical facility in southern Gaza.
The identified bodies were delivered to their families, and we as civil defense keep the unidentified bodies, take note of any distinguished marks for each of them, then we bury them.
Another mass grave, yet more Palestinian bodies are retrieved from this side whose names might not be remembered. Their identities are largely lost in an unprecedented war.
Lost but remembered, those who have been identified will now receive a proper farewell. For countless others, the search continues. More than 7,000 people are still missing across the Gaza Strip, most of them women and children.
That was Al Jazeera's Hani Mahmoud reporting from Khan Yunis on Monday. The charity Save the Children reported that since October 7th, the rate of attacks every month on medical facilities and healthcare workers, quote, has been higher than in any other recent conflict globally, standing at an average of 73 attacks each month. Becky Platt, a pediatric nurse at the field hospital in Rafah, told Save the Children that, quote, we've recently seen an influx of children from other hospitals with wounds and lost limbs, often needing skin grafting and multiple operations. But even getting hold of simple things like strong pain relief is a major challenge. When children have to undergo a procedure to save their limbs and avoid infection, we are forced to do it with less pain relief than we'd normally use. So I brought bubbles and games on my phone to distract them, but the reality is that a lot of these procedures need strong pain relief. That is causing huge distress, and it will also add to long-term psychological damage. The nurse added that, quote, we treated a 10-year-old boy who had some shrapnel in his thigh that had shattered his femur. He lost a lot of muscle and tissue, so he needed skin grafting and also had an external fixator on the leg. He had multiple operations, but he was so distressed by the way his leg looked that he couldn't even look at it. He was doing this silent crying that was heartbreaking, but this is a standard story. Children are psychologically destroyed by everything that's happened. Our colleague Maureen Claire Murphy reported this week that, quote, Israel is abusing UNRWA employees detained in Gaza in order to extract forced confessions against the agency, with detainees describing being subjected to acts of torture. The forced confessions are likely to be used by Israel in an attempt to incriminate UNRWA, the United Nations Agency for Palestine Refugees, Maureen writes. She adds that, quote, Israel is seeking to starve UNRWA out of existence through smears and unsubstantiated allegations aimed at drying up the agency's voluntary funding. Philippe Lazzarini, the head of the embattled agency, told the UN Security Council last Wednesday that Israel continues to block the provision of life-saving aid as part of its insidious campaign to push UNRWA out of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. More than a dozen countries, including top donors US and Germany, froze funding or suspended future support for UNRWA after Israel alleged that 12 of its employees were involved in the October 7th attacks led by Hamas. The allegations were made public by the agency on January 26th, the same day that the UN's World Court stated that there is a plausible risk of genocide in Gaza, Maureen writes. In her report, she adds that UNRWA staff released from Israeli detention told their employer that in addition to ill treatment that may amount to torture, they were, quote, subjected to threats and coercion and pressure during interrogations to incriminate the agency. These, quote, forced confessions against the agency included that the agency has affiliations with Hamas and that UNRWA staff took part in the October 7th attacks against Israel. According to UNRWA, some staff members were, quote, detained during the performance of their official duties for the UN, including while working at UNRWA installations and in one case during a coordinated humanitarian movement. Detained UNRWA staff were subjected to a litany of abuses, they say, such as beatings, including by doctors, attacks by dogs, and threats of rape and electrocution. The agency said that its employees underwent treatment akin to waterboarding and had guns pointed at them. UNRWA staff also experienced verbal and psychological abuse, threats of murder, injury, or harm to family members, humiliating and degrading treatment, being forced to strip naked and being photographed while they are undressed, and being forced to hold stress positions. For much more, read Maureen Claire Murphy's report, Israel Subjects UN Workers to Torture, on electronicintifada.net. Meanwhile, in the occupied West Bank, Israeli soldiers carried out a 2-day incursion last week inside the Nur Shams refugee camp in the northern city of 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜. Our colleague Tamara Nassar reports that during the 54-hour operation, at least 14 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces, including 3 children. The Israeli military carried out the operation with domestic intelligence agency Shin Bet and Israel's border police. The invading forces damaged and destroyed homes, commercial stores, roads, and other infrastructure, and left at least 25 Palestinians injured in the wake of the military raid, Tamara reports. Ayed Abu Aktesh, Accountability Program Director at Defense for Children International Palestine, said, quote, the Israeli military invasion into Nur Shams refugee camp marks the deadliest days in the occupied West Bank since the Second Intifada. The Tel Aviv newspaper Haaretz reported that when the invasion began on April 18th, more than 120 military vehicles carrying dozens of soldiers raided the refugee camp from multiple entrances and checkpoints, including through the Avnei Hefetz settlement, located on the western edge of the northern West Bank near Tulkarem. Israeli troops besieged the camp, as well as several homes within it. Israeli troops occupied several homes, turning some of them into military bases, barracks, and observation points, according to Defense for Children International Palestine. Israeli military reinforcements, including 3 bulldozers, sealed the camp, trapping residents inside, while others were unable to enter. Throughout the military raid, Israeli troops deliberately prevented ambulances from reaching wounded and killed Palestinians, the human rights group reported. The Israeli invasion resulted in widespread devastation, Tamara writes. Haaretz reported that bullets and grenades have left gaping holes in the walls of homes. Fragments of shells and LAU missiles are strewn across open spaces. Israeli bulldozers demolished infrastructure in the camp, damaging electricity, water, sewage systems, and telecommunication networks, leading to power outages during the military raid. Armed Palestinians in the camp confronted the Israeli invaders to protect their community, injuring several Israeli soldiers. John Elmer will have more on the resistance in Nur Shams later on in this broadcast. Earlier this month, the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention issued an active genocide alert over the situation for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, declaring that, quote, Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians across Palestine. 2 weeks ago, violence against Palestinians in the West Bank accelerated as large groups of Israeli settler mobs launched attacks on more than a dozen Palestinian villages following the disappearance of an Israeli teenager. For much more on the situation in Nur Shams and across the West Bank, read Tamara Nassar's latest reports, Deadliest Days in the West Bank, and genocide alert issued over Israeli violence in West Bank on electronicintifada.net. In Jerusalem last Friday, an Israeli court ordered the release of renowned Palestinian feminist scholar Nora Barrows-Friedman after she was arrested at her home in the Armenian quarter of the Old City. Maureen Claire Murphy writes that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜, a professor in the Faculty of Law at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, was released by the court on condition that she attend an interrogation and sign a financial guarantee, according to Adalah, a group that advocates for the rights of Palestinians in Israel. Maureen reports that, quote, Israeli authorities reportedly accused 𝐓𝐡𝐞, a Palestinian from Haifa who holds Israeli citizenship, of incitement to terrorism over comments she made during an interview on the Makdisi Street podcast. The police claimed in court that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 had engaged in, quote, serious incitement against the state of Israel by making statements against Zionism and even claiming that Israel is committing genocide in the Gaza Strip. The police, which are under the authority of far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, noted 𝐓𝐡𝐞's significant influence and said that they found posters in her home, quote, portraying IDF soldiers as an occupying army. During a court hearing, the state's lawyer pointed to 𝐓𝐡𝐞's factual descriptions of Israel's use of lethal force against Palestinians and the withholding of slain Palestinians' bodies, which are returned to their families in degraded conditions, as examples of the professor's dangerousness. The state lawyer also raised suspicion that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 has ties to Defense for Children International Palestine, a respected Palestinian human rights group that is among several such groups engaged in international advocacy declared as terrorist organizations by Israel. For much more on this story, read Maureen Claire Murphy's report, Court Orders Release of Palestinian Feminist Scholar Arrested in Jerusalem, on electronicintifada.net. And finally, journalists in Gaza are not only documenting the egregious and accelerating war crimes committed by Israeli forces, especially against Palestinian children, but they're also showing us scenes of joy and laughter. So we wanted to also include these two videos in this live stream report today. And that's just some of the news from on the ground in Palestine over the last few days. Please go to electronicintifada.net to read some of our crucial new features by writers in Gaza, now up on our homepage.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.